asking. It took 8 months to get a reply, and then finally they announced 6 different drugs. There are hundreds of drugs. There are 800 drugs listed as in short supply at the drug shortage database that Health Canada runs. So they were going to buy 6 drugs, and they were going to save $1 million by bulk buying. And so my jury is out. I think he's right. We pay more, relatively speaking, but as Dr. Evans has just said, we lowered that price. And I'm not convinced that we shouldn't pay more and that the price wasn't the right one in the first place. And the problem with this whole thing is, and the great frustration is, that nobody is doing those comparisons that you ask. Nobody is relating the shortages because nobody is counting the shortages properly in Canada. So we can't say that our shortages are any worse than the ones in New Zealand because New Zealand pays less or more for drugs than we do. We need some responsible accounting on all of the problem. And your other question was what?
Oh, sorry. Basically just, so my understanding is that in the generic market, there are only certain companies, actually most of them Canadian, I think, Apotex, Mylan, etc., that have access to the Canadian supply chain. So companies, say in India, like Ranbaxy and those other companies that will otherwise supply.
Right. Oh, yeah. And you were asking if Health Canada is doing anything to diversify that. They are not doing much about this particular problem in diversifying. You have to be really careful about what you do in a big hurry. Dr. Evans may disagree with me, but I think that one of the harms from the drug shortage was the meningitis crisis in the United States. Which came about following a shortage of the normal drug that would be injected in the backs of people who had back problems. And it got replaced on short notice by a scramble looking for a drug from another country that came from a compounding pharmacy that had ducked the inspections of the FDA. And basically, they were injecting meningitis into the backs of these patients. And over 700 people got sick, and over 60 died. Health Canada doesn't seem to be doing too much that one can access. That's certainly not what they're talking about. And a lot of the lobbying that goes on from the drug industry is trying to get Health Canada not to do too much about it. Thank you.
Yeah, the compounding pharmacy was the issue with the aspergillus that was in their preparation facility. And Linda, who's a pharmacist, will tell you about compounding pharmacies. That's a whole other beast. It was actually in Massachusetts where it all happened, but it did show the problems of regulatory requirements for inspecting and assessing these things, and that's what led a lot to the big beef up in inspections you've probably been hearing, not just the issue with Sandoz in Quebec, but in India, some of the manufacturers of large numbers of compounds which are used to then ultimately make product here in North America have been shut down or been sort of blocked by the FDA because they failed inspections. And that's a really big important safety issue, which is what Linda's been talking about. I mean, safety is the big thing, and whenever we don't want to solve the drug shortage problem by removing regulatory things that are really important for drug safety, in my view. And I mean, I'd let Linda talk about that, but that's a big issue because, you know, you got this competing pressure. You want the drugs, and so maybe you're going to expand facilities, but maybe the facilities can't be inspected and they're going to produce crappy drugs.
I'll add just a slightly different angle to that. So one of the questions I have in my mind is, I think Canadians deserve the economic data from these companies. So is the issue really that generics can't make money with the current system, with the new rules, or that they've gotten used to such ridiculous profit margins that they're not willing to accept less? So is it really that we're bankrupting them, or they just have to adjust to more realistic profit margins? And I don't know why it's so difficult to get economic data on the table about the cost of productions versus returns, because that data for patented medicines is publicly available.
Second question, over there in the back.
Thank you. Can you hear? Thank you for the excellent talk. I just had one quick question on, there's been a shift through generic tendering. So there was a report by Aidan Hollis and Paul Grutendorst from University of Calgary and the University of Toronto on pushing for generic tendering. So contracting out one or two, like in a bidding system, to one or two generic manufacturers. And this has been proposed to reduce a lot of healthcare costs. Do you, again, see this as a farther complication or problem in reducing the supply chain of generics in the future?
I'm convinced that's going to make the problem worse. And in fact has contributed to some of the problem we're currently facing. As companies have amalgamated, the number of suppliers has been reduced, and then if there's a problem, I mean, we saw that with the Sandoz-Boucherville problem, where the hospital world was paralyzed by a lack of parenteral medications because Sandoz was such a large producer of parenteral medications for hospitals. And I mean, it was a disaster because there were no other sources, and hospital pharmacies were left scrambling trying to import drugs from Europe, and the process for that is very difficult. So I think streamlining and having these competitive situations that result in fewer producers is going to be problematic for Canada. And in fact, one of the things that pharmacies have gone through over the last 5 to 10 years is they've lost their ability to negotiate with companies because the government has cut into that profit margin, which is actually, believe it or not, where pharmacies make their money, because making money off the dispensary part of a pharmacy, I mean, the return on the dispensing side is next to nil. Pharmacies survive based on the front shop sales. But there was an ability to make a small profit margin through negotiating because there were multiple generic companies competing for contracts with big companies like Shoppers and PharmaPlus, and the government took that away now, and so that incentive is not there anymore. And I wouldn't be surprised when we get down to the bottom of the story if that, at least in part, isn't part of the story.
Yeah, thank you for that observation. I want to lay a couple things on the table just for the rest of the discussion in answer to that. One is the theory, and it relates a little bit to what Yang Zhu was saying, the role of the group purchasing organizations in the United States, who have been accused by certain physician organizations in the United States of causing the entire problem in the world. And these are the middle managers who can get it for you wholesale, and they'll sell you not only the drugs, but IV poles and sheets and beds and whatever you need for your hospital, and so you become a member of the group purchasing organization, and they will get it for you. And as a result, they competitively drive down costs even more, and manufacturers are eager to get their product picked up by these large group purchasing organizations, some of which have a client base that is bigger than the entire population of Canada. So if they buy up absolutely everything, there isn't going to be anything available, especially in these marginal situations. It's worse than that. The group purchasing organizations are guilty of paying vendor kickbacks, which is actually illegal. It's against the antitrust laws in the United States, but they are never sanctioned for that particular practice. And every time it comes up in Congress, it's swept away because they also make big donations to congressmen. And so the marketing angle of it is very, very confusing. And even though we do have group purchasing organizations here in Canada, we have 3 that we use, and we have one right here in Kingston that we use and rely on. They don't seem to be guilty of such nefarious practices, but they're getting the leftovers of what's left from the companies in the United States. So licensing 1 or 2 drugs to a couple of generic companies isn't going to deal with that monster. The other point I want to make, and it relates to Sean and Varun and their whole initiative, is that aside from fretting about the drugs at the margin and going off half-baked every time a drug drops out for one drug, and ignoring the fact that it has something to do with another drug that's missing, we should establish a list of essential medicines in this country. 116 other countries in the world have such a list. Canada doesn't bother. And related very much to what Dr. Levesque was saying, there are about 8,000 active drugs available in Canada. Nobody in medical school can be responsible for knowing 8,000 drugs. Maybe 500. Maybe 500. And if we could establish what those 500 are that are reliable, good old-fashioned drugs, we could commit collectively to stocking them, rather than tendering the manufacturer 1 or 2 drugs at a time. It wouldn't be helpful. And I raise that now because I think that that's the main issue for the organization that's called us here tonight. Thanks.
Since it's been mentioned, I want to just point out, I don't know if anyone knows, in 2009, does anybody know what amount of money was given by assorted generic companies to pharmacists in the province of Ontario for things? Did you look it up? Do you know?
I think it's 750 million?
$750 million. I suggest to you that's close to $1 billion, and for us who are mathematically inclined.
Well done. Same kind of idea.
Yeah. We got a question over there, yep.
Hello? Is it working? Yeah, okay. Mostly related to Dr. Levesque's presentation. You mentioned that Canada is second in the world for physicians prescribing drugs, or sorry, second overall consumption in the drugs next to the United States. So I was wondering if there is a potential difference in the way physicians are trained in North America as opposed to the rest of the world, in the sense that we tend to give out more drugs, or if not, if there is a different perception in the consumer base in North America, in the patient base, that is, that they're more drug happy and they want more drugs prescribed. I don't know if you can.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I may defer part of the answer to my colleagues at the table. I can tell you that Queen's University, being one medical program in Canada, has been working really hard. So part of what I teach in the medical curriculum, or did up until this year, were issues related to this under the umbrella of evidence-based medicine, clinical epidemiology, critical appraisal. It all drives that way. And yet I'm constantly astounded, and so are the students when I present these data to them and ask them, how is it possible for some of the brightest minds in this country to be so easily duped? How is it possible for a company to take an antidepressant known as paroxetine or Paxil under the brand name, to give it a new name, same ingredient, charge double for it, and call it a non-hormonal postmenopausal medication, and have sales go through the roof? I don't get it. I've been spending 7 years teaching these principles here. I'm hoping that those students will do better than the ones that are there. I mean, I guess there's a reason they get paid the big money for marketing. They've figured out the psychology of selling. And if you think about it, in many, many ways psychologically, drugs are no different than iPhones. How many of you lined up to get the iPhone 6, even though your iPhone, whatever the previous version was, 5, C, D, E, F, G, did everything you needed to because it was sexy and snazzy and a little bit bigger and maybe had a few more icons on it or something? Drugs are the same. They represent new technology, and we have this insatiable appetite for new technology. And except there is a difference here. The decision makers are not the payers. The payers are the taxpayers, so it's a bit of a perverse marketplace with drugs. If I knew the answer, I wouldn't be sitting at this table, probably.
Outside this room is the poster for the session, and it talks about how only about 10% of what RxND does is actually in research and development. The other largest percentage is marketing. These guys know more about, for those of you who are either proto-doctors or are physicians, they know more about you than you do. And they can influence you in ways that you can't even imagine. And one of the most fascinating things about this is that, Dr. Levesque and I think all of my colleagues who teach in medical school, we talk about being objective and looking at things, but we cannot overcome that behavioral aspect. The first time a drug rep comes to you and tells you that you just said something that they have never heard another doctor say, you are amazing and unique, they are reinforcing exactly what your parents never gave you, which is this praise about you as the most amazing person on the planet. And you will get sucked into that vortex faster than you can say Paxil. And so that is what's driving it, because behavior is a much more important thing to influence than your intellectual knowledge. I would also suggest that the reason Canada sort of is only second to the United States in consumption is we are exposed to a lot of things that the Americans are exposed to because of our proximity to them. And the one that really sticks out in my mind is direct-to-patient advertising.
Yes.
That is a huge driver. There is, and now they're getting rid of CanCon in the CRTC's latest ruling. But the fact of the matter is, we all watch people like me, old people like me watch TV. You guys just go to Netflix. But essentially, direct-to-patient advertising is pervasive through the television media in the United States. We are exposed to it as Canadians. 90% of our population is basically close enough to the American border that you're watching American stations. And that has a huge, huge effect. The other thing that drives it, which is very prevalent, I think, in Western society, and maybe even more so than what you see in Western Europe, but in North America, is the drug companies have realized that involving themselves, financing, and being quietly behind patient advocacy groups is a very effective tool at driving use of drugs. And that looks, am I as a physician going to look at a patient advocacy group and say, oh, I'm not going to give you that. I mean, they're the patients. Everything's patient-centered now. But what we really And there is some data now about this, about the amount of money that they're driving into patient advocacy groups to get them to speak on their behalf, because if they're doing it, it's clearly for profit, but if a patient advocacy group's doing it, then it's just purely for the patient. And those kinds of things are what drive up utilization. Canada, by the way, has one other dubious thing. We prescribe literally more narcotics in our population, and this is the #1 province for narcotic prescribing is Ontario, per capita. And the further north you go, the more per capita expenditure in narcotic prescribing exists than in the southern part of the province. And that's one of the drugs, in the oral forms, you never see a shortage of. And those, a lot of those are generic, so I'll throw that out as a kind of interesting axiom.
Next question. Right here.
Is this working? Okay, so kind of related to the Canada having such high drug consumption, I was wondering, because I've heard that Europe has, like, medicine is more focused on preventative measures, whereas here in North America, they focus more on kind of like tertiary treatment like after the fact. So I was wondering if maybe that is somehow related, like if Canada switches over to more preventative medicine, would that have an effect on drug consumption?
I don't know if any of us have the expertise to answer that based on evidence, but I think it's just intuitive to think that the answer would be yes. One of my greatest pet peeves, both as a researcher and a practicing professional, is that we never have money to pay for preventative things in society. Every time you want $10 million for a women's health center to increase the uptake of Pap screening and breast cancer screening, we'll be told, sorry, there's no money. But to give $1 billion for a new drug is something we do without even thinking. And I don't get it. I don't know why it's so hard to put money into prevention. And so the more we put into treatment, the less we'll have. But we know we have finite resources in the healthcare system, and we know Canadians aren't going to accept paying 15–60% of their wages to subsidize the healthcare system. And so at some point we have to start making smart decisions. And I don't understand why we can accept a new therapy at a horrendous cost, and in the same breath say, no, we don't have $1 million for this preventative care program.
I've lived in France, and I think France is a country that takes a lot of drugs. And they have a lot of homeopathic drugs that are in the pharmacies together with ordinary drugs. And the World Health Organization has struggled with this kind of question ever since it was founded, because it wanted to be about health and not about disease management. And when the British established their National Health Service, they predicted that it was going to cost about £1.4 million in the first year, and that costs would go down. Because once they mastered taking care of disease, they would then start preventing disease. And in fact, within a decade, it tripled the cost of that healthcare system. People want their diseases looked after. And even in countries where diseases are prevented, people still die. And if they're lucky, they die of a disease, and not from being shot or run over by a car or beaten up. People are going to get sick. And a whole lot of the consumption of the drugs relates very much to what Dr. Levesque showed us, in the fact that if you live long enough, you put up with the vicissitudes of your biology wearing out. And I don't know how much of that actually can be prevented. I also agree with Dr. Levesque about the fact that we underfund prevention, and we also underfund research. So we don't generate evidence-based results on things that can't be patented. And one of the reasons we don't is because trials are really expensive, and the people who have the money to run the trials make drugs. So we don't get evidence-based results on exercise, for example.
So the issue comes up is really what's called opportunity cost. When you spend money on something in a resource-limited area, I sound like an economist. In a resource-limited area, you have to give up the cost somewhere else. So Doug Coyle, who I've already mentioned, my buddy up in Ottawa, And Matt Chung and I published a paper in Medical Decision Making, which has stirred up a lot of controversy. What we talked about was actually a drug for a rare disease. We talked about eculizumab, which has the record of being the most expensive drug in the world. It's about $500,000 per year per person if you're taking it for paroxysmal nocturnal hemoglobinuria. Yes, there'll be a test question on that later. And now atypical HUS. But there's not a lot of people who have it, but it's extraordinarily expensive. And what we did is we said, okay, well, if you want to fund this drug for the limited number of people with this rare disease, this is what it'll cost you, and here's what you could buy if you limited the funding or didn't fund it. And it was amazing. I mean, in terms of the amount of stuff you could buy, what Linda talked about is minor potatoes in what you could buy with eculizumab, save if you didn't pay for it. And it's that opportunity cost that we don't oftentimes include in our formulas when we're looking at paying for drugs. Because it's a massive amount of money, and that money could be used much better to benefit a much larger spectrum of the population than, in fact, a small number of people with a rare disease. But we are, as humans, are struck by the issue of trying to do the best we can for those who may be unfortunately afflicted with that rare disease. So we have within us a philosophy of something called the rule of rescue. And it called rule of rescue because if you fell off a boat, even though we might have projected in the future that you're going to provide nothing to society, we feel this compulsion that we have to rescue you. So we'll throw something out to you because it just seems so cruel and callous to leave you to float off into the ocean and never be seen again. And that applies to a lot of stuff that we do, and it certainly applies to our decision making around healthcare. We are prepared to pay millions and billions of dollars for getting 1 week increment in progression-free survival for a cancer, just because as a society we feel sorry for people who are afflicted with a condition like that. Although I will suggest to you in the cancer world there are different kinds of cancers. So I was very involved with CED in the Cancer Care Ontario subcommittee, and I chaired it for a while. And if you were a drug for breast cancer, you didn't even have to really go through the process. We would just approve you. You would walk in the door, we'd say approve you. If you were a drug for lung cancer, good luck. Because society's perspective on this is that if you have lung cancer, that's your fault. If you have breast cancer, that's not your fault. And so if it's your fault, we won't pay for it. There were tons of drugs for lung cancer that actually had meaningful incremental benefits in terms of progression-free survival and all kinds of other things in quality of life. And somehow, whenever it came up for a vote, we just shot it down. And then we said, well, we'll go to the Citizens Council, which is a council that the Ontario Public Drug Programs runs, which is 25 ordinary citizens from across the country, or across the province, who come together and tell us that they're not sick, they're just regular people. Some of them have illnesses, some of them don't. And we said, you know, is that really the right way to go? And they said, yeah. Scary.
We have another question? Yeah, over there.
Thank you for an excellent talk. I mean, I think you have to balance things a little bit when we start getting nihilistic about pulling at people's heartstrings when we think about things like HIV therapies. I mean, without partnership, effective partnership with industry, millions of people would be dead. But that's just my comment. So, Dr. Dobbin, how do you think we as Canada could get an essential drug list operationalized? What do you think needs to be done?
Well, I think there's lots of examples about how it's been done in other countries that we could find out how they managed to do it. What we need to investigate this problem, drug shortages, leaving aside essential medicines, and essential medicines, is we need to inform the voters and elect a government that would be interested in making it happen. The people who object to essential medicines lists are of two types, largely. One being the pharmaceutical industry, especially those making new drugs, who are very suspicious that a new cure for cancer is not going to be on the list, therefore people are going to die of cancer. And the rhetoric around that is very obstructionist, and if they have the ear of the government, it's not going to happen. Another group have been physicians, most of whom have never heard of essential medicines list and are not too sure what they are or why they should want one. And when they've been introduced in other countries, physician groups have gotten together to object to them because they argue that they interfere with the doctor-patient relationship and that the doctor should have the right to choose the best and most tailored and appropriate drug for the patient, except what we've just heard is how clever the drug industry is at getting our attention to make us want to, I can't believe that that thing is just Paxil repackaged. I didn't know that. I mean, they can do things to us and then we will act upon that. And so doctors have not, to the extent that they start paying attention to it, they have been resistant to the idea as well. And so we need to do a little bit of educating here in the country of the voters, and we need to do educating of our medical colleagues to get toward an essential medicine list. And if you could convince people of it, and one way might be to convince them is, it would be a whole lot easier to manage a drug shortage crisis if we had an essential medicines list. Because then we would know which drugs we are committed to stocking, and it's not saying that you can't prescribe other drugs. It's just saying that these drugs we commit to stocking. And in the main, they will be tried and true. They have to be evidence-based decisions. And the lists are always in all the countries of the world that have them, the 116 other countries, and the World Health Organization with its generic list. They are revised every 2 years. So drugs are taken off the list if they are superseded by something more effective, or they're shown to have some harm that they didn't know, as well as drugs being added. The generic list that the World Health Organization has about, I think it's 375 drugs, and if you count duplicates because there are more than one manufacturer, it goes over 400, about 445. But that would be way more workable. And we need to talk about it, first of all. We need to make it an issue. We need to make it something that politicians want to see happen. And that comes from the voters.
I would suggest, however, and just to throw a little bit of a wrench into the works, that we can't even really establish a formulary review process in Ontario. In 2006, when I took over the chair of the committee, we actually dedicated a few pharmacists to look at what's on the formulary and actually determined that we could throw out about 650 drugs, chiefly because nobody had prescribed them for the last 30 years. So some of those drugs that I remember learning in medical school, like risperidine, risperidine got thrown out because nobody prescribes it anymore. But it's actually very difficult because whenever you're changing a list, if essential medicines or a drug formulary, there are screams from all around that they need to be a stakeholder in what you're deciding, and they bring their totally different perspective to it. And I would argue that one of the problems that we have in any list of essential medicines is it's a perspective argument. And you know, Dr. Duffin's just given us the perspective that she's heard from the pharmaceutical companies, perspective she's heard from physician groups. You can imagine when you get even more stakeholders involved, all of their perspectives are a little bit different. And the way I used to see it is, I would meet oftentimes with my physician colleagues, especially specialists who were brought in by the pharmaceutical companies to make the advocacy for why this extremely expensive osteoporosis drug must be reimbursed by the Ontario Public Drug Programs, even though the incremental benefit and the cost per quality was something like $2.5 million. And they really brought that perspective that it was an essential medicine, because there were a small number of people who didn't do well on bisphosphonates and they needed to have this PTH-like drug to manage their osteoporosis. The arguments they brought forward, the evidence, were all very compelling. There was evidence. The arguments were at a patient anecdotal-based level, but that's a perspective argument. No one would argue, in fact, that that was an essential medicine. But that's what you get into, because it's a lot more complex than simply coming up with a list and saying I'm going to renew it every couple of years or maybe 5 years to look at it, because there are so many people who want their say in the development of that list that it's challenging, extraordinarily challenging.
And I just want to thank Dr. Woberser for her comment, because I think sometimes when we have these discussions, people assume that you're A, anti-pharma, and B, that you discount everything that they bring to the table. And there's no doubt that many of our therapeutic advances have been because of pharmaceutical involvement. Often, albeit, the discoveries are made in universities, and what the industry brings is the marketing and manufacturing aspect. So a lot of things that are actually manufactured or produced by companies are actually university discoveries. But I think where I draw the line, or where I get really uncomfortable, is when a company is producing antihypertensive number 15 in a category, and you say to the drug rep, really, like, do I need a 15th one of these to look after patients? And the response is, hey, it's a $1 billion market. If we get 1% of it, we're laughing all the way to the bank. And so my challenge is that where we want the industry to put its money? In developing those kinds of drugs, or in developing the ones that you're talking about that really make a difference?
Next question? One more?
Squeeze in one more. Just because I think we have the insider perspective from the ODPD. My understanding, especially now that the talk about national pharmacare is all in the air. There's a lot of discussion about it. There's a lot of enthusiasm for it. And I guess one of the things that I struggle with is the concept of, the healthcare budget is set at the provincial level. And as we move towards perhaps kind of alluding to the last question and the development of essential medicines list, I understand that CADTH, the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technology in Health, does have the Common Drug Review that looks at, recommendations for a specific new medication that comes onto the market. And yet, at the provincial level, there is actually discrepancy between the decision that's made at the national level and what's done at the provincial level. So I wonder, moving forward to national pharmacare and potential development of these lists, whether there needs to be a reconsideration of the way that we make these formulary lists. Do you feel that perhaps the provincial decision-making is redundant or adds to the context? Thank you.
Okay, I'm taking this one. So one of the things you said it correctly, yeah, although you're a very smart guy and you know all this stuff, is you called it a decision. It's not a decision, it's a recommendation. The decision lies with the government. And even in OPDP, the CED, which I led, we made recommendations to the executive officer who could easily say no, yes, or I'm going to negotiate a deal with the drug company and enlist it anyways. I often have publicly talked about one decision that they made where the committee made a firm recommendation that they not list a new drug for hypertension that was a renin inhibitor. And we said there's a problem with what we think is going to happen in the safety signal. They went with a deal, and there was some very interesting politics behind it. It was listed and reimbursed as a third-line strategy, by the way, for which no evidence existed as a third-line agent. And ultimately, that drug has now got a black box warning and has now been taken off the market because it was killing people, or could have harmed people, is maybe a better way of saying it. I'm starting to sound like a journalist in using hyperbole. So recommendation is the big issue, and so the provinces continue, a lot of the larger provinces, BC, Alberta, Ontario, Manitoba, and Quebec, still have a process in place to review CADTH recommendations, principally because him who pays the piper calls the tune. And the issue has always been that there may be nuances to what CADTH recommends. So CADTH does a great job with provinces who have limited resources to do drug evaluation for reimbursement. The smaller provinces, lower populations, or don't have the experts in their population to do it. But essentially the issue has always been is that until there is a sort of national sort of budget or expenditure, it's going to be very difficult to introduce a national plan because no province wants to be told you must spend this money and that's being directed by a federal authority, right? I mean, I've been to Spain and talked about it. Spain, believe it or not, has a similar system to ours. There's autonomous regions, but there's a federal government. And the autonomous regions do not want to be dictated to by a federal national authority, even if that seems to make some sort of sense. So we do have to drive things that are going to take the issue of health expenditures, which are a provincial responsibility. And if the national government wants to, or the federal government wants to take a national strategy forward, they have to figure out how they're going to make that palatable to the provinces as they pay. In Ontario, healthcare takes up about 48 to 49% of the entire budget of the province of Ontario. And if a national strategy came along where now all of a sudden those drug costs were determining what you should reimburse was done by somebody else, the finance minister in Ontario and the government theoretically are not going to be very happy if they have to pay more money for this. And so that's where it gets very, very, very tough to sort through, because there is this disconnect between something like a national pharmaceutical strategy and who's ultimately going to pay for it. And the provinces have a lot of political differences, as you know. Different political parties are in power in those different places. Some stuff like that, minor things.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're actually going to end right on the dot. If you do have any questions, please come to them. They probably have 10 minutes maybe to spare, maybe more, less than that. But please join me in thanking them so much for being here. And thank you so much for all of you guys to come out here. I hope that not only are you educated on these issues, but you also feel empowered to go out and do something about this, whether or not it's making an essential medicines list a federal election issue, or whether it's further advocacy on campus. So if you guys are interested in kind of what we do in terms of access to medicines in Canada or globally, you can check us out at queens-uam.com. We do have general exec applications due on Sunday if you guys are interested in that. Thank you so much for your time, guys.
Great discussion. Thank you so much. Thank you for doing this. It's